Hello and welcome to the Political Dispatch, the podcast that explores the big ideas and policies shaping our world. My name is Tom Spare. Today I'm flying solo. Lily and Sid will be back with me soon. In this episode I want to talk about two sizable events that took place on either side of the English Channel within days of one another. On the 9th of September, the French Prime Minister François Bayrou called a vote of confidence in his government and lost. And on the 13th of September, the largest far-right march in recent UK history convened in central London. What links the two? Well, France's President Macron lost an election last year in part thanks to the rise of the far-right in his country. And the Unite the Kingdom march in London was orchestrated by far-right activists, amongst them Tommy Robinson, Elon Musk, and curiously enough, former French presidential candidate Eric Zemmour. These two events speak to the moment we are living through. So let's first take a look at the political chaos taking place in France. And although I'm without my trusted co-hosts Lily and Sid, I was able to recruit a guest contributor. I'll let him introduce himself.
My name is Charles Devellennes. I'm a senior lecturer in political and social thought at the University of Kent. And I work on French politics and political theory. I'm trained in the history of political thought. And I've written some books that are classified as sociology. So a bit of an interdisciplinary thinker, really.
So, Charles, France has had 7 prime ministers in 8 years and 4 in the last year. Why has there been such a high churn of prime ministers under President Macron? And what does this constant change say about the state of French politics?
It's an excellent question, Tom. So we have had, yes, indeed, quite a few prime ministers in the past few years and a very high number, 4 in the past year. So what this means, I think, for French politics is that the Fifth Republic is failing, right? So I think that's the main lesson of the past year is that the Fifth Republic is not fulfilling its original function. So its original function, if we go back to the 1950s, is precisely to avoid this type of situation where there is a blockage in Parliament, right, in the French National Assembly. So the Fourth Republic was plagued with such blockages, and we can see that now the Fifth Republic is falling into the same trap. So that's the first level of analysis, is that there is an institutional failure and that all the measures that have been put in place by de Gaulle in the 1950s to ensure that there is no blockage such as the one that we're seeing now are not working anymore. That the political landscape has changed to such an extent that we cannot have a functioning government, and that despite extraordinary measures in the constitution of the Fifth Republic to allow for essentially minority governments to fulfill their functions. So that, then you can ask, why is that the case? Why is it that the Fifth Republic is failing in one of its primary functions? And part of the reason is that the political landscape has been completely shaken by Emmanuel Macron. It's not just, it doesn't really begin with him in 2017, but he manages to capture a moment, which is a much wider crisis of political representation. And so this crisis of political representation has been going on for decades, really. And it culminates in the arrival of Macron, who shakes up the political parties in 2017. He crushes the socialists in the election. They are almost wiped out of the French political landscape. They have to sell their headquarters in Paris because essentially they're faced with bankruptcy. So the socialists are, the left, the traditional left party of power, is shaken by Macron. And he repeats the same process in 2022 with Les Républicains, who are the traditional Gaullist party, although it's mutated a lot since the time of de Gaulle. But they're also almost crushed in the 2022 legislative elections. They lose a lot of seats. and they're relegated as a minority party. They fail to meet the 5% thresholds in order to be reimbursed for their political campaign. So it's a catastrophe for essentially the party of de Gaulle. And so Macron manages really well in the kind of politician's terms to crush his opponents. And so what we have is a much more fragmented political landscape. And in 2024, when he calls for snap elections, Macron makes a gamble, and we end up with a National Assembly that's even more divided. So now it's divided into 3 blocks, within which the 2 traditional parties of power play a minor role, actually, each of them. So on the left, we have the New Popular Union, Nouvelle Union Populaire, that is a sort of alliance of 4 left-wing parties. So the Communists, the Insoumis, the Mélenchon's party, the Socialists, and the Greens. And in the center, I would say center-right, because there are very few center-left people left in that coalition. In the center, we have Macron's alliance, essentially. And on the far right, we have the party of Marine Le Pen. This new political configuration is essentially forming a coalition impossible, because the left doesn't want to ally with the center-right, and definitely not with the far-right. The far-right doesn't want to ally with any of them. And then the center is saying, both of the other groups are essentially the extremes, and they're the only ones that are reasonable at the center. So we have a deadlock that's been entirely created by Macron's snap election of last year, 2024. And a lot has happened since then, but essentially the blockage is still the same. Right? We're still in the same situation than we were over the summer of last year, which is that it's impossible to find a compromise between the 3 main blocs that now represent the French people.
That really neatly provides the context. Now, the former Prime Minister, François Bayrou, was ousted by a vote of no confidence. What triggered this vote, and what was Bayrou trying to achieve with his proposed budget?
So François Bayrou, he called a vote of confidence in the National Assembly, so in the lower chamber of the French Parliament. He didn't have to. It was entirely self-inflicted. Under the French Constitution, he doesn't have to call for a vote of confidence, and he has to survive a vote of no confidence in case one is tabled against him, and there have been ones tabled against him, and he's won every vote of no confidence. Because it gets a bit technical, but a vote of no confidence, essentially you need an absolute majority of the members of the National Assembly to vote for the destitution of the government, of the Prime Minister. So that is 289 MPs at the moment, depending on whether someone has resigned. It could be a bit less, 288, but at the moment it's 289. And it's really difficult because that means the 2 main blocks of the opposition that I was talking about earlier, the left and the far right, have to vote together. And on the left, there are 4 parties, and that means every single one of the 4 parties, plus the far right, have to vote for a no confidence vote. So it makes it really difficult to create the conditions for all the opposition parties to come together and vote against the Prime Minister. It has happened last year in December, but when it happened, it was only the second time that it happened in the history of the Fifth Republic. The first time was in 1962, and then the second time in 2024. So a huge gap between the two. So you can see just how difficult it is to have a vote of no confidence. But that's not what happened to Bayrou. Bayrou actually made history in that he is the first Prime Minister of the Fifth Republic to have lost a vote of confidence, so one that he called for. So he called for this vote of confidence, and he lost it. And one of the main reasons I would say why he called for it is because there was a huge social mobilization planned for the 10th of September. So he called for a vote on the 8th of September and essentially resigned the next day on the 9th, and then he wasn't Prime Minister for the big social mobilization. And he didn't want to deal with it. It was a kind of, Gilets jaunes 2.0, so the yellow vest movement that started in 2018. It was kind of called for by a group of citizens, initially with some links to the far right, but quickly became a much wider appeal to people on the left. And all of the four left-wing parties called for mobilization on the 10th of September. It was 200,000 people in the streets, 80,000 police mobilized for repression, really. I mean, that was what the Interior Minister called for, was for repression of the demonstration, because the demonstration itself was illegal. It wasn't called for by an official organization, and that's one of the requirements under the law to have a lawful demonstration in France, is that it needs to be called for by an official organization. And because it was a citizen initiative, it was de facto illegal under French law. So police repression was very high on the day, and there have been dozens of documented cases of police violence on the 10th of September. But despite this, mobilization was quite high, much higher than expected. Initially, the police planned for 100,000 people, and it was double that number. And despite the fact that people were scared to go out, right, because you don't want to go and meet an 80,000 strong police force mobilized for repression, and despite the fact that the mobilization was technically illegal, though you are still protected under French law, so there are some differences to be had here. You're still protected if you go to an illegal demonstration, but people who organize it could be liable for damages, essentially. So Bayrou essentially feared the people and called for a vote in the National Assembly, knowing that he didn't have the votes. And the vote of confidence only requires a simple majority. In the end, it was more than 289 MPs who voted against him. So, he would have lost even a vote of no confidence, but essentially it was easier to get him out through a vote of confidence. And so he made history by being this sort of first prime minister to lose a voluntarily called for a vote of confidence. But it's because he was under tremendous pressure. And I said, there was social mobilization, but also there was political mobilization against him because he has to work on the 2026 budget, and he's unable to find a majority for that budget. And he wants to have essentially an austerity budget, and no one wants to vote for an austerity budget. At least the two opposition groups don't want to vote for it. So he was unlikely to be able to pass a budget in any event. So two really big reasons: democracy, essentially. People's democracy, direct democracy, and representative democracy was forcing him to reckon with the fact that he's in a minority. He commands at best a third of the political forces of the country, and even a bit less than that, really.
Okay, so that's the former prime minister. Since the fall of Bayrou's government, President Macron has appointed a successor, Sébastien Lecornu, as the new prime minister. So who is the new French prime minister? What is his background? And what does his appointment signal about Macron's strategy moving forward?
So on the day that Bayrou resigns, on 9th of September, Macron immediately appointed Lecornu. And it was the obvious choice, really. It was the person that we knew because it had been leaked. He wanted to appoint last December, but Bayrou essentially blackmailed Macron, said that if Macron didn't nominate him as prime minister, Bayrou would take his MPs with him and leave the kind of centrist alliance. So that would have been catastrophic for any government under Macron, because Macron already doesn't have a majority, and losing another group within the few loyalists that he still has would have been catastrophic. So Macron wanted to nominate Lecornu back in December last year, and instead he waited until Bayrou could no longer function as a prime minister, and he's now nominated him in September of 2025. So Le Cornu he comes from the right. He's a very early convert to Macronism, so this kind of center-right new party that followed Emmanuel Macron's rise to the presidency in 2016, 2017. And he's the oldest kind of standing member of the government. He's always held a kind of a ministerial level post since 2017. So he's been there since the beginning, essentially. Even though he comes from the right, he's joined Macron very early on, and he's been able to stay as a member of the various different governments, various different prime ministers. So he served under all of them, essentially, and has been a true and loyal ally to Macron. So that's the kind of the political trajectory. He's a social conservative, so he's known to have participated in the huge demonstrations against gay marriage under François Hollande. So he was one of the leading figures arguing against the legalization of same-sex marriage. And he's quite close to military sources. He holds the rank of lieutenant in the gendarmerie. So the gendarmerie is a kind of it's a police force in France, but it depends on the defense ministry, not on the interior ministry. So there are it's split between the police is split between the kind of civil and the military branches, and he's a member of the military branch of the police, so quite close to law enforcement, quite close to the military, because of his rank in the gendarmerie. So he's, as you can expect, someone who's very much on the right of the political spectrum, the traditional right, the kind of Gaullist right, the right that has been undone by Macron. So he joined Macron very early on, and in many ways, it contributed, him and many others joining Macron contributed to the demise of the old Gaullist party. So now he's been rewarded for his 8 years of loyal service to various Macron governments, and he's in charge of the government. His reputation is that of an excellent negotiator, and he'll certainly need every single skill that he can get in terms of negotiation in order to move forward. Right? He has to find a compromise, an impossible compromise, between essentially two parties that have to agree to the budget for 2026, and that at the moment are making noises that they might not vote for it. So on the right, Les Républicains, so the old Gaullist party, the one that he comes from, that essentially want a tough austerity budget, but also don't want any tax rises for businesses and for the wealthy. And on the left, the socialists, who are the keenest to make a deal with the government, because they're keen to be seen as a responsible party of government, and so they want to have a deal with the government in order to have a budget that would be better for them and their interests and their interests of their constituencies. And essentially what they want is increased taxes on the rich, right? So they've made a kind of concrete proposal for additional taxes. And so there's a compromise perhaps to be made somewhere there, but you can see that initially it seems like an impossible task, because on the right, people are calling for no taxes on the rich, and on the left, people are calling for taxes on the rich. And so the devil will be in the details, and to see if there's any form of negotiation that Le Cornu can make between those two rival groups. It seems to me, I may be proven wrong, but it seems to me that this compromise won't happen. Is just too difficult to find something that the socialists can claim as a win, and therefore, vote or at least abstain for passing the budget, and that the Republicans can also vote for. It seems to me that there is no overlap between those two groups' positions, and yet that is the task to be found. And that you need those two groups to vote together, kind of grand coalition, the type of grand coalition that you can see in Germany often, where the Christian Democrats and the socialists vote together. This is the kind of compromise that needs to be made at the moment, but in France it's very difficult to make. And one of the main reasons for that is that we're getting to the end of 2025, and in a year's time, the campaign for the next presidential election will begin. So making these types of compromises now will actually compromise the party's ability to run an effective presidential election campaign in a year's time. And so none of those parties really want to alienate their base just before, a year before the campaign effectively starts. And so the timing is terrible. And that's why everything is coming to a crunch now, is that we're moving closer and closer to the presidential election, the next one in 2027. And every party is positioning themselves for that election. Everything is about that election. There are important elections, municipal elections happening next year, including like the election for the mayor of Paris, which will also play a very important role before that. But really, it's the presidential election that everyone is looking to, and so it makes these types of compromises really, really difficult now. And they may have been possible in last year. Eventually, a budget passed last year. The socialists abstained, the far right abstained from a no confidence vote against the government when it rushed through a budget through parliament. So eventually, the parties of opposition accepted an austerity budget last year, but I think for this year it's going to be much more difficult to accept that for those parties.
So that's the new French Prime Minister and the rationale behind his appointment. I guess the broader question is, with a high turnover of prime ministers, a divided parliament, and the former presidential candidate in Marine Le Pen now in prison, is France at risk of becoming an ungovernable state? And I suppose as a follow-up to that, we need to ask, what does this mean for the European project and for Ukraine?
It's a really important question, I think, for the future. It's really difficult to predict the future, obviously. So all of it is more a matter of opinion. But I think what's not really a matter of opinion is that, to an extent, the French Fifth Republic is fulfilling its purpose. So I started by saying that it's failing, but that's, maybe a bit of an overstatement, because the Constitution is making sure that the state functions, right? We had a budget for 2025. It's possible that we get a budget for 2026. And essentially, even though the presidential allies only have a really tiny minority and have found new allies in the traditional Republicans who have since joined the government since 2024, even though there's a minority government, the country functions. Right? There hasn't been a US-style shutdown. There hasn't been a sort of firing of public employees, closing down of schools, no issuing of passports or anything like that. Right? Like the functions of the state have continued despite the political instability. So it's a crisis of democracy and a crisis of legitimacy, but it's not really a crisis of the state. The state functions. People are still getting paid, public services are still happening, and there hasn't been a breakdown of the state. So is France going to become ungovernable? I don't think so. I think the crisis is one that is very serious, and it's a crisis of legitimacy and democracy, but it's not a crisis of political power. Political power is being exercised. We can see that despite massive mobilization against the government on the streets of France, the government is able to mobilize 80,000 police officers to repress demonstrators. So it's not a question of whether the state will collapse, but what kind of state it's becoming, right? What kind of state France is mutating into. And for me, that's the real question. So the Fifth Republic has failed because it was, and credit to de Gaulle for this, it was a democratic constitution. Right? And de Gaulle, when he lost a vote, stepped down. Right? He accepted that the will of the people had not been met in 1969. And so there was a kind of gravitas about politicians at the time, where they accepted the democratic decision of the people. The problem is that the constitution gives a lot of power for mainly the prime minister, actually, but in practice, it often ends up the president that holds this power, because the president appoints the prime minister, so it can get rid of any prime minister who doesn't do what the president wants. And it gives a lot of power to this one person, essentially, prime minister and or president. And when that person denies the outcome of elections, refuses to accept the will of the people, essentially, then there's nothing really to stop the state from mobilizing social forces against democracy. And that is the really scary thing, is not that France is becoming ungovernable, but that it is governing very efficiently, very effectively, but against democracy. I didn't answer the second part of your question, which was what does it mean for Europe and Ukraine? How to say? So European project is not, I would say, not very ambitious, but equally quite ambitious at the moment, in that the European institutions have started borrowing money on their own terms. So that's a stepping up of powers for the EU. Macron is very pro-European, but quite a few of the forces in the opposition, so Mélenchon's party, LFI, and Rassemblement National, Marine Le Pen's party, are quite Eurosceptic. Now, they've both turned down their Euroscepticism, but they're initially quite Eurosceptic, and some of their positions will bring them against the institutions of the EU. So if any of those parties come to power, we can expect that France will be not at the forefront of European integration. So even though the European project, I think, has scaled itself back a little bit in terms of its ambitions, France has been promoting the few changes that have been happening, and a France under another party would be very different. But they would need to win the elections, which isn't quite done yet. So at the moment, not much change, but potentially in the future. And well, for Ukraine, all parties are in support of Ukraine. So at least officially, there is no real opposition to support for Ukraine, like we've seen in other countries, like in Hungary, for example, or in Slovakia. So I don't think there will be much change, to be honest.
I guess that lends well to discussing President Macron's position. Is there a scenario where President Macron's position becomes so untenable that he's forced to resign? And what would be the consequence of that? Would we see an immediate election, or would we have to wait until 2027 for that?
So the question of whether Macron will resign, essentially, or be forced to resign, will be destituted as president. I think the answer to that is no. There is no realistic scenario where Macron steps down before the end of his second term that will be, halfway through 2027. There are unrealistic scenarios, but I think they would require a level of contingency that is difficult to predict. Essentially, I think there'd have to be a sort of widespread violence and loss of life in the streets of France, a kind of big mobilization where people lose their lives for Macron to even contemplate stepping down. And I don't wish that to happen for obvious reasons, and I don't think it will happen. It's possible to have a few people dying here and there in demonstrations, but I'm talking much more massive numbers. So that's the kind of scenario that I could see where Macron has to step down because essentially his position has become untenable. But barring that, I think he has all the powers that he needs under the Constitution of the Fifth Republic to keep going, and he will. So that's my 2 cents on the future. Now the interesting question is whether he will really step down. I don't doubt that he's not going to run again in 2027. He can't run for more than 2 consecutive terms. But, he could stay on the margins. He could become prime minister, for example. If one of his allies is elected, he could get another kind of position of power, of importance in French politics. Or indeed, he could get a kind of job at one of the international organizations, so in the EU, for example, or IMF, World Bank, these kinds of institutions. So there's a possibility that he doesn't step back from politics, but actually keeps being involved with the view of coming back in 2032, because he's quite young. He will be 49 at the end of his second mandate. So in 2032, he will be, in his mid-50s. And that's actually still a young age for a politician. So I don't think we've seen the end of him, even in a year and a half's time, when there are elections and he's not president anymore. That's not the end of Macron and Macronism.
So I guess in conclusion to this part of the episode, what are the hurdles the new government faces? And what would it take for it to succeed where others have failed?
And last but not least, I think is, what would it take for the government to succeed where others have failed? It's a really interesting question. The real thing for any government at this stage is to compromise, right? To find a compromise that gathers enough, if not support, at least lack of opposition, so that one of the main parties of opposition refuses to vote a no confidence vote. And I think the most obvious of these is for the current government is the socialists, as I said, some kind of compromise, a kind of grand coalition with the centrists, the Macron's allies, the Republicans and the socialists. So Macron's allies and the Republicans are already kind of voting together. And the question is, can you bring the socialists in the equation? It's possible, though I think unlikely, for the reasons I gave before, that all of those parties will be concerned about the presidential election and will make calculations based on what they think would realistically give them a chance to get elected, to get their candidate elected as president in 2027. I think there are other options, though, not for the current government, but there are other options for Macron, right? And 2 of those options are, first, to let the left try to appoint a government, try to see if the left can find a coalition. So far, since last year's elections, we've had 4 coalitions of the center, right? Well, we'll see for the fourth one, but the government hasn't been decided yet by Le Cornu. But essentially, since he comes from the center, from the center right, he's likely to stick with the program. But there could be a center left coalition, and then the question would be: would the left be able to gather enough support in order to avoid a no confidence vote? Again, very difficult, right? Because it would have to find a way to drive a wedge between different parties within Macron's camp. Maybe they could get Bayrou on board and his party, but I think that wouldn't even be enough. Or they'd need to convince the far right to abstain in a no confidence vote, which again, I think would be very difficult because there are some very strong enmities between the left parties and the far right. So we could see the left trying to form a government and see if it does any better than the center. I mean, so far, 3 prime ministers of the center have failed. Maybe it's time to give it another shot to give a shot in a different direction rather, and that would be the left opportunity to rule. Of course, Macron doesn't want that because they want to undo everything that Macron has done. Right? That's the official kind of line of the left. That's the only thing that they have in common. Really, the 4 parties of the left is that they oppose what Macron has done. So Macron is not keen on that option. And the final option is to let the far right rule. Right? So you could envisage a government led by Marine Le Pen or her allies, and where they make some compromises with the center right. And I think that's much more likely to function. So part of the answer is, and I think that was Macron's gamble actually last year when he called for snap elections, is that part of the answer is let the far right give it a shot with a minority government. So their powers will be very limited because essentially the left will always vote for a no confidence vote against the far right. And so if the centrists vote against the far right, that's it, the government falls. So the government could fall very easily. So it will be extremely limited in what it can do, and it will have to make compromises with the center and with the center right. And I think that there's a much better chance of this working because then the far right cannot, vote against the government. It would vote against itself. But of course, it's very unpalatable, especially before a presidential election. If you have a supposedly centrist party that has been elected against the extremes working with a far-right government, that is, politically very unpalatable. But in terms of passing a budget, they would have a much better chance. So that's the compromise that I think could work. Not my preferred solution for obvious reasons, but I think that was essentially Macron's gamble. He thought the far right would do far better in the elections last year, would not have an overall majority, but that they could be appointed as the government, and that essentially they would fail. Instead, what he got is that the far right didn't do as well as predicted by the polls, and even though they're the largest single party, they're not the largest force in the National Assembly, and so he hasn't appointed a far right prime minister, Macron, but he relies on the far right in order to rule, essentially. So he had the worst of all possibilities happen as a result of the snap elections last year, but he could still try his initial strategy, which I think was to put the far right in power so that they would fail, right? And that having failed, the ground is the grass is cut from under their feet for the next presidential election in 2027. So that could still be a possibility, and I think it's much more likely to happen than the left being given a chance to govern.
Plenty of food for thought there, and really appreciate Charles for his contribution and for his thoughts. Before we head into the next segment of the show, I want to highlight a recently released episode from the Be the Change Media Network. On Wednesday, the Political Dispatch co-host and network founder Lily Mott interviewed her dad, Chad, a high school teacher in the US, about a recent high school shooting which took place in Lily's home state of Colorado by a pupil of Chad's. It's a really moving and timely episode. And I would say, I know Lily really well, and we've interviewed her dad previously for a previous episode of this show. And it is a really eye-opening discussion where, in the UK, school shootings are very, very rare. You have to look back to the Dunblane massacre to see something that's comparable. And that very much speaks to the nature of political discourse in America, gun violence, attitude towards violence, the role of the media, and the role of money and inside influencing in the way in which laws are made in America. And here's a clip from that episode.
What the problem is not necessarily radical voices that are liberal or conservative. The problem is allowing ourselves to be in those kind of echo chambers, and allowing ourselves as adults to be irresponsible in terms of our own intake and our own rhetoric, and looking at this and saying it's black and white and it's us versus them. I mean, that kind of division, is self-defeating, absolutely, for families, for individuals, for the country. And I think, you have to try to go out of your way to be better informed, because the more informed you are, the less ignorant you are, the more likely you are to be more moderate and be more appreciative. You're going to have less antipathy towards people who are different than you, and less prone to that kind of dangerous division that can lead, to modeling, unfortunately, bad behavior and potentially dangerous behavior. Instead of filling your minds with ideas and your heart with love and acceptance, you're filling your gun closet with weapons for the coming apocalypse. I think, you're modeling the bad behavior.
So I'd really recommend that episode. You can find it by searching BeTheChange.podcast. The episode is called Evergreen Strong: Lessons from Tragedy, Healing Together, and Building a Better Future. Now let's head across the channel to London. On Saturday, the 13th of September, a huge march was assembled with protesters joining from across the UK. The sheer number of people in attendance was, a really big part of the story. So estimates by the police and the media put the crowd at somewhere between 110,000 and 150,000 people. This made it one of the largest far-right gatherings in recent UK history. And just for a bit of comparison, more recent protests of the far right have only garnered as much as sort of 10,000 people. The striking thing was the number of arrests. So a minister stated that the minority who attacked police would pay a price, but the number of arrests at the time of recording stands at around 25, 26 people. This is a stark contrast to other recent protests. For example, a Palestine Action protest recently saw nearly 900 arrests, with a large number of people being held for a specific offence under the Terrorism Act. Critics have accused the Metropolitan Police of a two-tier policing approach, highlighting that far fewer officers were deployed at the Unite the Kingdom march, despite violence being widely predicted. Now let's talk about the key people behind the march. While it was publicly fronted by far-right activist Tommy Robinson, whose real name is Stephen Yaxley Lennon, who's also one of the main speakers, the event attracted a range of figures. Other speakers included the controversial media personality Katie Hopkins, and notably a former French presidential candidate and far-right politician Eric Zemmour. What needs to be considered here is the deeper sort of political and social meanings behind the march. The march was an explicit expression of anti-immigration sentiment, with speakers claiming that migrants have far more rights in UK courts than British people. Marchers chanted slogans like "Send them home" and carried placards that read "Stop the boats," which is a sort of slogan that was used by the previous Conservative government and is still being used by the Labour government as well. The rally was also a powerful demonstration of a toxic transatlantic political feedback loop that seems to be going on. The crowd paid tribute to the recently assassinated US Conservative activist Charlie Kirk, holding a minute's silence and carrying banners in his honour. linking his death to a perceived campaign to silence the right. Perhaps the most significant element of the march, and probably one of the most worrying, was the involvement of Elon Musk. Addressing the crowd via video link, Musk called for a dissolution of Parliament and a change of government in the UK. He also used inflammatory language warning that violence is coming and that you either fight back or you die. He framed his message as an appeal to British common sense to combat what he called massive uncontrolled migration and the whole woke mind virus. His direct intervention in UK politics from a far-right platform was a truly extraordinary moment. It marks a change in terms of interventions from outside forces, given that Musk isn't even from the UK, he doesn't live in the UK. This event has been viewed by many through the lens of the Overton window, a concept that describes the range of ideas politically acceptable to the mainstream at any given time. For years, the views expressed at this march, such as the call to send them home and the narrative of a great replacement, have been considered radical outside the window of mainstream political discourse. But the sheer scale of the rally and the fact that its key messages were amplified by figures like Musk suggests that the Overton window is shifting. The march's supporters see it as a powerful expression of justifiable anger and as a festival of free speech, where their long-held views could be spoken without shame. The visibility and normalization of these ideas on such a large scale indicate a new and worrying moment in British politics and political discourse more widely. The day after the Unite the Kingdom march, I attended my monthly writing group at Chapter Arts Centre in Cardiff. During my writing session, I wrote a piece that I'm likely to develop further and might feature on future episodes. One of the characters makes the following statements. Your favourite takeaway is Indian, your barber is Kurdish, your favourite football player is Muslim, you love reggae, your patron saint is Turkish, and you call yourself English. Being English, and being British for that matter, is not a binary thing. It's not us and them. It is me, you, your friends, family, your community, and all other people around you, that community and beyond. The UK is not a homogenous country, and it will never be purely white English, Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Irish. It's been forever shaped by immigration and history and empire. And to be English is to celebrate diversity and migrants and different cultures and points of view. Look at the takeaways you eat and the footballers you cheer on in the terraces and from your living room. Look at the flag you wave and the people who cut your hair. Look at the roots of your patron saint. The world you are marching for does not exist and perhaps never existed in the first place. The flags you wave don't belong purely to you or your views. They belong to everyone, whether you're a first-generation immigrant or a sixth-generation Brit. So, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this episode. If you enjoyed this edition of the Political Dispatch, even if it was minus Lily and Sid, I would recommend our previous episode, Flags, Reform and Reina, which offers a bit of a precursor to what we discussed today. You can find us wherever you found this episode. Please like, subscribe and share our show so we can contribute to reach more people and drive up interest in these vital conversations. My thanks to Dr Charles Devellennes, who gave such a comprehensive view of what's going on in France right now. This podcast is a Be The Change Media Network production. My name is Tom Spare, and you've been listening to the Political Dispatch.